they're doing. Well, there is an episode of the 1990s sitcom, and it pains me to think this was in the 1990s. It was one of my favorite shows, Seinfeld. It was an episode where a small soup takeout restaurant opens in New York City. I think some of you know what I'm talking about. So the soup in this story, the soup is amazing, so good that there's a constant, eager line of patrons who are cramming inside the place. But the owner of this soup stand, he is an absolute tyrant. If you do not order your soup in exactly the right way, or heaven forbid, you ask for bread with your soup, the owner screams, "No soup for you!" And you must leave in shame, hungry and humiliated. That owner became known as the Soup Nazi. And if you're a Seinfeld fan, you know that episode. Even if you somehow missed all of that, though, you still know the type of person. The rule enforcer, rigid in their way of doing things. And we've all encountered people just like that. Usually we don't like them very much, or we fear them, or maybe both. But if we're honest, brutally honest with ourselves, we've all had our own Soup Nazi moments. Moments when, in one way or another, we have told someone else, "No soup for you." That doesn't mean we're bad people, it just means we all live by rules. And when our rules get broken, watch out. Of course, we have to have rules. We need standards of behavior. Rules help keep a world that's already challenging from spinning completely out of control. And there are a lot of rules and standards of behavior being broken these days, and it's really troubling. Few things make us more indignant than someone blatantly disregarding our standards, our rules. For example, I have a hard and fast rule about honking when I'm driving. I never honk. Unless, of course, the person in front of me deserves it. Seriously, honking for me is a last resort. To me, honking is crude and boorish behavior, and if someone honks at me ever, I immediately assume the worst. You better be warning me that my car is on fire, the wheels have flown off, and the bridge ahead has collapsed. But if you're just honking because I'm not going fast enough for you, no soup for you. So we have a complicated relationship with rules. They protect us, but they can also trap us sometimes. Rules are necessary, but they can also build walls. And the more I study the life of Jesus, the more convinced I am that he did not come to hand us more rules. He came to show us the difference between living a rule-oriented life and living an engaged and liberated and useful life. Useful. Now that word may sound a little utilitarian for Sunday morning, but think about it. It's true that Jesus never once said, "Blessed are the useful." But again and again, his life demonstrates that we're really most alive when our life is of use to others. When our life awakens meaning and hope and joy, not just for ourselves, but for someone else. When we're serving others, donating food for the hungry, working in a kitchen for unhoused people. Just simply being on the lookout for opportunities where we can live out and put flesh on what we talk about here in church, to be a light for someone in the darkness, to be a hand lifting up someone who's fallen, to help unburden someone from the condition that's kept them physically or emotionally imprisoned. To provide healing and hope, to be useful. And that brings us to today's story. Jesus was teaching in a synagogue one Sabbath day, and there was a woman there. She was bent over for 18 years, unable to stand up straight. So let's picture her for a moment. Because we've all seen people with a condition like this, osteoporosis or arthritis or a curvature of the spine. This woman was always looking sideways, never eye to eye, bent low by a burden that she didn't choose. She was used to the smallness of her existence, maybe afraid to even hope. And after 18 years, she could barely remember any other way of seeing the world, but still, she showed up for worship. And on this particular Sabbath, there was a special excitement at the synagogue. A preacher and prophet, Jesus of Nazareth, had arrived, and he would be teaching there. So she and the others in town had heard reports about Jesus, how he talked about God's vision for the world and for human life, how that would be arriving soon. And it was even a reality in the present, and how, as if to demonstrate that wonderful good news, he had healed countless sick people. He was a one-man hope machine. Now, this woman, she probably wasn't sure how much of those stories to believe. People tend to exaggerate, after all. And her life already had too many disappointments. But that day, Jesus sees her. He really sees her. Maybe more than anyone ever had. And he calls her forward. And in front of everyone, he declares, "You're set free from your ailment." And he lays hands on her, and in a moment that must have taken everyone's breath away, she stands tall, like a flower unfolding to catch the sunlight. She praises God with a voice that probably had not been heard clearly in years. You would think that the room would erupt with nothing but celebration, but not everyone is clapping. The leader of the synagogue, the keeper of the sacred rules, he has a different reaction to this. Now, he had also heard about Jesus, and he had extended an invitation for him to speak at his synagogue, which in itself was a very gracious thing to do because, Jesus' reputation among religious leaders, well, it was less than stellar. Jesus was an unorthodox rule breaker, saying and doing things that went far beyond the doctrines and social customs that they all needed to rely on for their very identity and their cohesiveness as a people. Because they lived in a context where rules were absolutely necessary. Their world was already topsy-turvy enough without Jesus stirring the pot. Their nation was occupied by a foreign power, Rome, with cultural and moral standards that they could not stomach. And their only hope, really, was maintaining some semblance of stability by sticking to the beloved traditions that had been handed down from generation to generation, by staying true to the customs and rules that made them who they were and that gave their lives meaning. But here was this Jesus, one of their own, mind you, constantly calling into question their most sacred truths. So the leader of the synagogue, a local keeper of those sacred truths, maybe wanted to show that he was an open-minded kind of guy by allowing Jesus to speak there in the first place. But to be on the safe side, just in case Jesus said something really outrageous, the leader of the synagogue had allies there too. Friends who could back him up, to honk the horn in case Jesus needed a reminder to stay in his lane. But the synagogue leader was not expecting this woman, a regular who had been bent over for so long. She just sort of receded into the background usually, one of those invisible people. Every group's got them. He never expected her, of all people, to be called up and healed and for his whole congregation to erupt in cheers. It was a bit much, really. If Jesus had wanted to put on that kind of showy demonstration, the least he could have done was to have had the good manners to wait until tomorrow. Now, it's not that the leader of the synagogue is against this healing. He's not a heartless guy. He's just deeply uncomfortable with the timing of the thing. There are rules for this. So he complains, there are 6 days on which work ought to be done. So come on one of those days to be cured, not on the Sabbath. In other words, there's a right way to order your soup, and this is not it. Now, it's easy to laugh at this guy, to shake our heads, but honestly, he was trapped too. He was trapped by these rules that had been handed down to him, the customs that gave his people structure and identity, especially in this really chaotic, occupied world they lived in, where keeping the Sabbath wasn't just stubbornness, it was survival. You keep the Sabbath holy, sacred, a day of rest ordained by God by not performing work. And that's how they drew the line between being faithful to all they held dear and throwing their identity away. And yet, Jesus sees it differently. He asks, what does it really mean to be faithful? So Jesus doesn't dismiss the Sabbath, he honors it, but he redefines what it means to honor it. The Sabbath's not just about not working, it's about setting people free. It's about restoring what's been broken. It's about declaring, you are beloved, you belong. You're released from whatever bondage that's kept you shackled. You are home. And in that light, healing isn't just allowed on the Sabbath, it's the whole point of the Sabbath. The woman in the story is healed not just in body, but in her identity. Jesus reminds the crowd that she's a daughter of Abraham, a full-fledged member of their community, no longer damaged goods, no longer invisible, no longer bent under shame. And the leader of the synagogue? Well, Luke tells us that he was ashamed when Jesus called out his hypocrisy. And you can't feel shame unless deep down you know the truth. Deep down he knew. Rules are meant to serve love, not the other way around. So, if stories like this are ultimately about us, and of course they are, I have to ask myself, how many times have I clung to a rule, not out of love, but out of fear, or just because a rule was the path of least resistance, because to break a rule meant or required courage I don't think I had? How many times have I been more concerned with maintaining order and decorum than with stepping out over the boundaries of my comfort and my convention to be the embodiment of love for someone else? This is instead of building them higher. When we reach beyond what's comfortable and safe and expected, and we actually do something useful for the sake of somebody else. The real rule, and the only rule that matters, is the rule of love. And these days, that, I think, should always be our standard when we ask ourselves what we should do and say next in this moment in history, when we're faced with unprecedented challenges to establish norms and even the rule of law. What's our next move? What are the next words out of our mouths? How do we have hard discussions with neighbors and family members? I think we go with the most self-giving, useful, healing, loving action, whatever that looks like. We will not go wrong when we do that. That is the rule of love. And that is a rule worth living for. Amen.